Hey guys, it's BlockchainBrad, and today we're talking about all things NEAR. That's right, and something that is known as the NEAR protocol. In the hot seat today, we have someone who is a lead technologist, someone who is certainly well experienced with regard to really understanding blockchain and understanding cryptography and understanding exactly how that relates to business. His name is Alexander Skidanov, and he is here to really explore, explicate, and explain exactly what the NEAR protocol is. Alexander, thank you very much for being here.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks for having me.
Not a problem. Now, the NEAR protocol is something that, as I mentioned before, few people know about. It's something quite novel. It states that you are the mobile native protocol or blockchain. And more importantly, it says that you are a sharded decentralized computing platform. Now, it even mentions in your white paper that's quite difficult to do. Could you break it down for us, though? Simplify it as best you can, even though you are, I guess, a tech geek, and importantly so because you are a big brain in this space. Can you simplify this for us? Why is it important to have this new innovation?
Right. So blockchain has a potential to revolutionize quite a few areas of our life, and ideally, I can envision a future in which majority of services I use are running on the blockchain. Right. For that to happen, the blockchains need to be significantly faster and significantly more accessible, right? And those two things we're trying to address. And in terms of scalability is a prerequisite for any blockchain which launches these days, right? And if you look at any protocol, there are dozens or hundreds being built. They all have certain scalability improvements. Many of them, which are not sharded, however, still have some intrinsic limit, right? So, for example, if you consider I will name a few examples, right? If you consider Thunder, for example, if you consider Solana, those are way significantly faster than Ethereum or Bitcoin, right? So Solana benchmarks more than 1 million payment transactions per second in their latest benchmark, which is that's ridiculously high number. However, it is still those are payments transactions, right? It's going to be different for smart contracts, but it is still limited by a single machine. Right. So for any particular use case, they can run maybe NASDAQ if they want to on that machine, but they will not be able to be a platform for all applications in the future. They will need some sort of just sharding if they want to be the platform.
Sure. So you're making the point there that there isn't a capacity for either parallel or horizontal scaling, building out the holistic nature of this scaling capacity, and often it's based on one node.
Yeah, so effectively, each of them is limited by what one node can process, yes. So at the end of the day, all the transactions have to be processed. There's got to be this one entity or maybe multiple entities where each of them has to process every single transaction. Right? Sure. And that will be a limiting factor. They can still process way more than Ethereum today. Ethereum processes how many, like 1,000, 2,000 transactions per second.
Sure. Well, let's talk about that, though, in the context of your sharding technology, because we've seen sharding happen several times, actually. You'd know that as being an expert in the field, but it's not something new. So why is your approach to sharding so unique? Or is it because you're focused on this mobile native aspect?
So as a matter of fact, there are very few serious teams which are working on sharding. So one notable one is obviously Ethereum. Ethereum is building sharding, and their design is relatively, it's very strong. The researchers who work on Ethereum sharding are very strong. And there are a few others which are very well known. Zilliqa is very well known, even though they have certain limitations. They do not shard. They only shard processing of transactions, meaning that no single node processes all the transactions, but they do not shard state, meaning that every node still stores the entire state. So the processing power is not a limitation anymore, but the storage remains a limitation. In the world of databases back in the day when sharded databases did not exist, and they were built, but they were all in the future. What people were doing is they were using some sort of, let's call them layer 2 solutions. People would put memcached in front of their database that was solving scalability short term, but it was requiring some effort, and it was not applicable in all cases. So layer 2 solutions today, or off-chain solutions today, they are that short-term solution. They do exist today, Plasma, state channels exist today. Plasma, I think, is going to be used in practice until the end of the year, if not yet. They do solve scalability very well, right? State channels can allow people process huge numbers of transactions per second, but they require you to change your logic significantly. That's an effort on your side. They're not applicable everywhere, and they have their own drawbacks, such as mass exits is one big problem, and there are a few others, right? So that's a short-term solution,
right,
which solves a practical use case. But long-term, if you want applications like large-scale applications to run on blockchain, you do need layer one solution, meaning that you need the blockchain itself to be scalable and sharded.
Right. So in that context, I want to ask you this because many people will be wondering. There are quite a few layer two solutions out there. There's, obviously you'd know some of them that are inherently linked to some of these core layer one solutions as well, such as Ethereum. Do you think they also have a use case and applicability, given that what they're doing, some of them are using sharding in their layer two solution, they are building out the scalability capacity of Ethereum simply by improvements, by parallel scaling, by sharding, by side chains. Do you think they still have validity as we move forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that they are the only solution today. So if today you want to use blockchain, and we're talking, so I guess we will be talking about use cases later, but we are talking to people who use blockchain today. And naturally, most of them who start using Ethereum very quickly with adoption hit the limit of what Ethereum can offer. So they all move to layer two, and layer two is working like a charm today for them, right? The only problem is that layer two, effectively, if you're aware of that, there's this famous triangle of
the trilemma, yes.
Yeah, trilemma, which says that you cannot have decentralization, scalability, and security. What layer two, to an extent, gives you is that they're giving you security and scalability, right? So you can securely move in and out your assets to the plasma chain or to the state channel, and they give you scalability because it's super fast, but at the cost of decentralization. The plasma chain is often operated by a single entity or few maintainers who are, in principle, can be malicious, in which case you would have to exit the plasma, right? They will not compromise the security of your assets, but they will compromise the security of the operation of the chain, right? Mm-hmm. So layer two is a great way to get scalability and security, which is often, in practice, often that is exactly what you want, and you're ready to put trust in the plasma or state channel operator,
right?
Or you would operate it yourself, actually, yeah.
Okay, well, let's go back, though, and talk about your key features now and your core service and products. Now, you focus on mobile, particularly the words native come up a lot. Can we talk about that as to, why it's so important, why it's novel, and why arguably you are potentially leading the way in this aspect of blockchain design? Right,
so there are two key aspects here which are very different, but both very important. Key aspect number one is that the sharded chain the sharded chain can grow linearly in terms of how many transactions it can process, how much data it can store with a number of nodes. Up to a certain limit, it's called quadratic sharding. So there's still a certain limit which is imposed, but it is significantly higher than what a single machine.
And what kind of numbers are we talking about there, though, Alex, with regard to the kind of potential?
Right. So we do not like comparing TPS in general because TPS is a very abstract number.
Okay.
Payment transactions you can process a lot. Right, but if you start executing some smart contracts which are heavy, then one single smart contract can saturate, like good few seconds of execution. But ultimately, you can scale to, effectively what quadratic sharding means is that if one node can process, let's say, 1,000 transactions, then your cluster can scale up to, let's say, 1 million transactions, right?
I see. So it is interesting that you are using the term cluster because I've had that discussion with some other blockchain teams as well. That's going to be really important because you're basically making the whole operation more efficient because you're not putting all the pressure on all the nodes at once.
Right. Well, I'm using the term cluster because I'm coming from the databases world.
Okay.
Right. So I meant the blockchain network, the entire network.
Sure. Are you doing anything inside the sharding system, though, to reduce pressures of having to operate all the nodes simultaneously? Is there anything in plan with your sharding design so that you are going to cluster?
So most of the sharding designs which I'm aware of, and which I believe in, so Ethereum, ours, there are a couple others. I don't want to advertise other protocols today, but they shard networking as well, meaning that there's no transactions are only broadcasted within the shard and processed within the shard, right? So effectively, yes, every shard does not affect much other shards or at all. Right, unless there's any cross-shard communication happening, right? And so going back to the importance of mobile, for the network to scale now, you need more and more operators who would operate the network, right? And so to put some numbers, to put it in perspective, Ethereum today has 15,000 nodes, or maybe that's an older number, right? So maybe it has like, well, let's say it has 30,000 nodes, right? If you want to have each class, if you want each shard to have at least 200 to 400 nodes, that puts you like, that gives you a ballpark of how many shards you can have. So if you want to scale beyond that, you would want to have significantly more nodes operating the network, right? And so if you require a beefy server to run a full node that processes transactions, you can only have that many of them, right? So if somehow we do manage to make mobile phones, like let's say high-end mobile phones, low-end laptops, to operate the full nodes, that would enable us to tap into huge pool of nodes of machines that can be full nodes now. And the term full node, yeah, go ahead.
I just want to ask you that, and I do apologize for interjecting sometimes, but you mentioned the term if, and that made me want to ask you this. Now you say if we have the technology, if we have that mobile hardware. Now, what's the current state of that? Do we have the capacity right now, or is this something that is planned in the future in your design, that it could be, the technology could meet the needs of, or satisfy the needs of the user with technology that, or with hardware that doesn't exist yet?
So it does exist, and we do have a prototype locally that shows that you can have a protocol which can run from the high-end phones, low-end laptops. The core ideas there, and the core ideas actually, they're not unique to us. The core ideas is that there are two reasons why you need a beefy server to operate an Ethereum node. One reason is that you need to do proof of work. You need to compute hashes, and you need to compute them super fast. Otherwise, you will not have a chance to mine a block, which is a majority of protocols today, including ours, using proof of stake instead of proof of work. So that is gone. You're not computing any hashes. The second reason is that you need to process all the transactions in the network, which if you want, like Solana, for example, has a very expensive machine that runs the leader that processes all the transactions. Now, if the system is sharded, and you can significantly reduce how many transactions each node needs to process, while the system as a whole will still be processing quite a few, right? So from this perspective, we're removing, by having proof of stake and sharding, we're removing two biggest reasons why you need the beefy machine to operate the network. Naively, it still will not run on the phone. You still need to design quite a few things in a very special way for them to run on the high-end phones.
Right.
One of them is
that would be the term native in that respect. I do apologize for asking again.
Right.
So talk us through that native terminology and how that relates to the user and why it's important.
Right. So it's mobile native so the one I just described, that's one reason why it is mobile native, right? So every single design decision we're making sure that the binary that will be operating the network can run on the mobile phone. And the second reason is now that we have, that also serves as a gateway to the user. So if you as a person want to run let's call it a full node. So the term full node becomes a little less meaningful because it's not it doesn't store the full state, it doesn't process all the transactions. So I will use the term full node. If you can run this node on your phone, then that means you have this application on your phone, right? So that application can also now serve as a gateway to all the distributed applications which are running on the network, right? And so now we can also extend the way that the applications are written in the network, that they not just, so today the smart contract only stores the logic of the contract. If you want something user-facing, that today has to exist off-chain, right? So for example, UI for say CryptoKitties, it doesn't live on the chain. It's a separate client that you can run that connects to the blockchain. So now at this point, you can also have, you can design it in such a way that the front end of the application also lives with the logic, right? And so this way, this gateway can connect to the network and serve you the applications. So it owns, and the network now owns end-to-end application, which is good for the user because user can validate that not only the logic does what they expect, but also the front end communicates in the proper way.
So that's where you really set yourself apart from something like CryptoKitties in that you are end to end.
Yeah, right. Okay. So CryptoKitties today, or like any application which runs on blockchain, the client is separate and it is hosted somewhere, right? So you do not know what happens when you communicate from your application with the blockchain, right? There is a middleman effectively.
Right. So you mentioned also with regard to dApps or distributed applications, what is the plan for you with regard to how you're going to onboard this as well, and how many, I would imagine that you've got some internal designs as well, or some dApps that you're planning out. Are you building a developer network? Because I understand that's a big focus of yours.
Right. So we are actively building a developers network. We are not, unlike many other blockchains, we are not inventing our own language. We effectively, the virtual machine which we at least plan today to run on the blockchain is WASM, which means that you can use C++, Rust, or TypeScript to write smart code.
So essentially quite an agnostic virtual machine system.
What agnostic?
In the sense of you're going to be using different languages. You're not going to do Solidity, for example, and just apply that to your design, but more agnostic in terms of the languages that you can sort of work with.
Right. So to an extent, EVM that powers Ethereum is also not, it's not exclusive to Solidity. There are other languages which compile to EVM. It is extremely hard to write compilers for existing languages to EVM. Right. So that's why we don't see emergence of transpilers from other languages to EVM. While WASM today already has compilers from C++, Rust, and TypeScript, each of which has very high adoption. Ideally.
Right. And is there plans to increase others, for example, JavaScript or anything else like that?
Right. So yeah, so we primarily target applications. So there are two major, I would say, areas of where blockchain can be adopted. One of them is smart contracts, where they are actually researching languages is very important because you want them to be verifiable. You absolutely need to be certain that they cannot be tampered with. Another one is applications, where that would be examples of, let's say we want to run Twitter on the blockchain or ride sharing on the blockchain or any of those applications. There, the verifiability is less important as long as you have some sort of governance in place. But the ease of development is important. And so from this perspective, you would definitely want such languages as Python or JavaScript to be the primary languages for development. Neither of them compiles to WASM, and that's a huge challenge to compile them to WASM because they do not have static typing, which is...
So is that an issue, given that, and the reason why I ask, and I do apologize for interjecting so much, but you want to grow a huge developer base. I've read that. So how are you going to interact with those who use Python or use JavaScript to really broaden the scope of the developers that want to use and work with you?
Right. So for people who use JavaScript, I think for them to start using TypeScript is super straightforward. TypeScript is I want to say subset of JavaScript. It's not a very accurate statement, but in terms of actually onboarding Python or JavaScript, we are researching actively whether we can run V8 or a Python virtual machine on the blockchain. The primary challenge is there. First of all, there's actually no reason why there's only one virtual machine. Technically, there's nothing that stops us from running EVM, WASM, and other virtual machines. But there are certain requirements. You want them to be to provide you certain invariants, right? If you run the same smart contract on multiple or same application on multiple machines, you need to be absolutely certain they produce the same result, right? And so that's something that in WASM there was extensive research to confirm this is the case. EVM was designed with this goal in mind, but with V8 or Python, that is not obvious that if you just run V8 and run the same code on two machines, you will get the same result, right? So that is one.
So WASM's done their homework in that sense. So how is it going with regard to the robustness, the magnitude of the developer network that you have built? Let's talk about that in terms of real time and what you've really achieved so far.
Right. So in terms of building developer network, it's very early stages, right? We started very recently, and primarily what we're trying to establish is so as you mentioned, we have a very good team from the industry, unlike most of the other blockchain protocols, which so in blockchain for some reason it is very common to get people from academia.
Yes, that's true.
And which is sort of it makes sense to some extent because people are used to trust academia quite a bit, but also it is sort of interesting because there are very few good decentralized systems outside of blockchain that came out of academia, right? Most of them come from the industry.
And you raise a very fair point. So let's talk about that because I wanted to talk about your team later because it really is something to focus on separately. It is an outstanding team. But I'm glad you mentioned that because often the academia is designed for hype. To be fair, I would imagine some of these teams, when they first start up, their startup, they contact these different parties and say, look, we're building this, we'd love you involved. It isn't always from the grassroots that person or that cryptographer is, doing the blockchain work. They're simply doing often mainstream stuff and then move across into this project. So right from the outset, one thing that's really clear about you guys is that you're not doing that. You are literally developers yourselves.
Right. Yeah. So I agree with your statement. For many protocols that you can observe today, there is a person with a very big name involved, who in many cases is not that involved. In some projects, they are very involved, right? Mm-hmm. So it differs, but there are multiple cases where we know people personally, and we know that they are not very involved, and they were the reason why the project managed to raise two-digit millions.
Basically branding. I mean, as you mentioned, we can talk about some of them that do, and some I certainly do too, that are very actively involved and leading projects, but the majority are not. So I really appreciate your frankness about that. But let's talk about you. Your developer team is outstanding, really outstanding. Let's talk about exactly why. I mean, you have achieved gold medals. You've achieved things that simply no other team I've read have done from a developer standpoint, from a decentralized technology standpoint. You definitely are leading the way with proof that you are performing.
Right. So the team we've built is primarily coming from our. So there are two founders in the company. It's myself and Ilya, and I'm coming from a company called MemSQL, which is a distributed analytics platform, which is like it has large deployments in many Fortune 500 companies. And Ilya is coming from Google, right? So we tapped into those two networks, and so there are quite a few people in the team today are from MemSQL. We have employee number 1, employee number 4, and we have another person, and we three of us were responsible for sharding, cross-shard transactions, and distributed joins at MemSQL. So we were building the decentralized
for those companies. For those companies you were talking
about. For MemSQL specifically, yes. We three of us came from MemSQL, and then we have 4 people from Google. So the team is coming from the industry experience, and quite a few of us know each other back from the day where all of us participated in competitive programming, where notably there's one competition called ACM ICPC, which is the official world level competitive programming championship. So there's 3 people on our team have gold medals, 1 person has 2. So it's
that's quite amazing. I mean, I have to say, and I don't like to FOMO ever, and I won't be, but it was amazing to read the success. It was like reading that you had some Olympians in your team if you were, representing a sports company. It was equivalent to that to me when I read that. So, I mean, it is quite significant that you do have this kind of credibility injected into your team, and particularly from a programming standpoint, because obviously that is the crux of any really good blockchain.
Right. Yeah. And so most of the team assembled within 2 days. So we grew from 3 people to 10. Literally over Sunday and Monday. Mm-hmm. And that was a few months ago, right? And also something that is worth mentioning is that the Near protocol, the entire company, is only 3 months old, right? So we started way more recently than the majority of the competition. And so we need to execute very fast to catch up with everyone, right? So Dfinity has been building their protocol for 4 years. For us to compete with them, we need to execute super fast. And Dfinity, for example, also has super strong team. Right. They
do. They also have a super strong bank account, given their raise. So, yes. Let's talk about that for a moment, because I do want to talk more about your team. And I'm sorry to sort of interject with different topics, but you mentioned that you're very young. 3 months is going to really concern a lot of people when they hear that. Are you concerned that you perhaps are a little bit late to the game? And can you achieve this while we're in this crypto chasm, in a bear market, lots of things going on? You need to raise capital, and we'll talk about that too. But are you concerned about that?
Very, very slightly, right? So we did a lot of homework when we started, and even more homework in the last 3 months. And it appears to me that there's very little competition specifically in the sharded protocols, which I think, the way I see the industry and the space in general is that we're going to see launches of mainnets for a lot of protocols which are not sharded within the next month, right? So Thunder will launch. Algorand, Space Mesh, Dfinity hopefully will finally launch, right? So a lot of very, very strong projects will launch which are not sharded. That will be first of all, that will be very interesting to watch, right? Because they will be fighting for the pool of people who are using Ethereum today, and they will be fighting with Ethereum as well, which now has layer 2, which solves partially the problem.
And I'm glad you said that, because people don't realize the magnitude yet, I think, of just how interesting the space is about to get, with all of the vying for the audience, for I guess the participants and users and investors and I guess supporters of the utility. It's going to get crazy soon, because they're all wanting a piece of this crypto pie.
Right. And then, so hopefully adoption will start growing significantly faster once that happens. Eventually, people will need sharded protocols, right? So non-sharded protocols and layer 2 will only work for as long, right? So this is where, so Ethereum is building sharding. They have a 4-year roadmap. Vitalik is hinting that it could be launched next year. We work very closely with Ethereum Foundation, meaning that we interacting with them, we talking research with them, and we can see exactly where they are. And that's pretty optimistic for them to launch next year, because majority of the development happens by people who are very enthusiastic, but they have full-time jobs, they have other commitments, right? So that slows them down quite a bit. Our goal is to launch next year, right? That is very aggressive, right? Compared, like if you compare with other protocols, how much time it took them to build, it is very aggressive. But also I think our incentives are way more aligned, because those protocols, you know, if you raise 60 to 100 million, at that point, you don't really need to work or launch at all, right? So at that point, you most of the people in your team have their lives figured out, right? We're not using the same approach, right? We work hands down, and we have very good chance of launching.
Well, let's talk about this, because you know, you've suggested that if you have a big raise, then perhaps you could relax a little bit. But some of these teams, like Dfinity, for example, I imagine are not doing that because they're aware of people like you. So, are you concerned again that they have this capital, they have this huge draw card with the ability, particularly being in the Silicon Valley, to build out developer teams second to none? Again, you've got a lot to do because you've got a small team still. Do you think that, you know, are you precluded in any way from really developing the first steps that you need to do to build out what essentially needs to be a competitor in the mass market for next year? Are there any issues you have with regard to that? I mean, I know you've mentioned that you're confident, but do you think that there's a way in which your team can scale? You know, are you raising the capital to build this out? And are you confident that, you know, you can do it?
Right. So first of all, as I said, we just actually maybe it was not on the records, right? But we just finished raising money. We raised 3 million, right? So it's significantly less than what Dfinity has, but it's way more than enough to hire a pretty good team in San Francisco, where we're located. And so we're growing our team, and we're positioned to execute pretty quickly. There's certain, so the competition is pretty fierce. However, I think majority of us, there's this citation, I don't remember whom it is attributed to, but there's a saying which says, we're not competing with each other, we're competing against people who don't care, right? So I think I think the market is so large that even if, let's say Dfinity launches and we launch, and Dfinity is bigger than us, the market is so large that still each of us can have a huge, huge adoption. Yes. So from this perspective, it is way more important for each of us to, first of all, actually launch the protocol, right? So we could have had the same interview in 2015 talking about how Dfinity and Algorand will launch soon within a year, right? But they did not, right? So let's hope they will launch within a year, but it is, again, unclear. And then, but all of us, all the protocols combined, we're not competing really, we're all fighting for actual adoption of the blockchain technology. And this is where we need to work together. And I'm not concerned about other protocols launching, I'm more concerned about
very, very, very mature way to look at things. Let's talk about, though, the threats of the centralized entities like Google. You're in SF right now. Are you concerned at all that they have significant capital? They could arguably make the switch into blockchain, make the switch into centralized mechanisms or consensus mechanisms that support this kind of change. Are you concerned that they could really change the game far beyond Algorand, Dfinity, and the like?
I think that blockchain is one space where Google and Facebook and Microsoft have absolutely zero chance to make any difference, right? So there's today, so blockchain, so the hype is lowering, right? So today hype is not as high as half a year ago, but half a year ago, anyone who has any name could have raised, $30 million on practically anything, on a white paper and a website, right? And so everybody attempted to do that, right? And there's a reason why, for example, like consider all the messenger platforms, right? Telegram raised money quite a bit. Not a single other messenger platform, which I'm sure some of them did attempt to build blockchains, managed to. Right. And there's a very strong reason for that. Telegram is the only messaging platform which is not associated with any centralized entity or government, right? So Telegram is known for their decentralized structure, right? For majority of engineers, you don't even know where they located, right? They position themselves as such, and this is why they succeeded, right? Mm-hmm. Google is as centralized as it gets. So in the blockchain world, they have absolutely no chance. I think that's my opinion. That's very, but I think they have no chance of creating any difference by building a protocol. They can still obviously leverage blockchain in their favor so they already have this on Google Cloud. They have access to data from blockchain. Microsoft is advertising heavily right now that on Azure you can deploy blockchains, you can like run blockchain clusters. So Microsoft, Google, they're leveraging blockchain, but they will not be able, I think, to successfully launch a blockchain platform.
Right. What about IBM? They seem to be very different. I mean, they have a very strong blockchain focus. They have really interesting protocols as well. You'd know them, a whole suite, in fact. Are you concerned about them? So
IBM, you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah, so IBM, the only protocol I know from them is Hyperledger.
Yes, but they have several layers of that. We have Fabric, they have Sawtooth, they have quite a few.
So my understanding is that all of those are private blockchains, which are targeting a completely different use case. They are designed for private deployments between enterprises, right? So it's a different use case. I think the competition will be separate. I personally do not understand private blockchains in terms of what exactly they provide you.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about that though in the context of enterprise, because are you focused on enterprise? The conversations I'm often having with CEOs, I had one last night with Gilbert Verdian from Quant Network. He was saying that if you're not thinking in the business frame, perhaps you're not really understanding the game. Are you thinking about building the business in that direction too, or are you solely focused really on the end user through, as a mobile native system?
Right. So we are thinking primarily about enterprise at this point, because most of us are coming from the B2B space, and that's something we understand, while targeting individual people is significantly harder, right? It's very hard to predict what people will want, while enterprises, you can understand them way better. Okay. Right? So we have dedicated sub-team within NEAR that is doing specifically that. They outlined multiple verticals such as IoT, supply chain, gaming, etc., where blockchain is used today, right? And so we have a pipeline of more than 700 people to whom we're talking to understand their needs, where their scalability issues are.
Let's talk about that 700. Yeah. Give us some clues. Give us some names. Let's go there with it, Alex. I really want to know what kind of partnerships you're forging. I think the people want to know to really add to the value of the NEAR protocol as you move forward. Right.
So I don't want to oversell what we're doing, right? As I said, we're a 3-month-old company, right? So we are at the very early stages. We just started having those conversations. We maybe had like a few dozen by now. Effectively what we are seeking is we're trying to understand, are people actually hitting the scalability issues? Are people hitting the issues of people not being able to easily use their distributed applications, and whether that would make sense for them to ultimately, when we have something to offer, to move. We just published a blog post with a company called Nucleo they work with the Chilean government closely on multiple use cases in supply chain. Right, so that's a joint blog post we just published. So that's one of the partnerships we started building early on, and there are multiple others baking, but I think most of them are still going to come from the future conversations. Effectively, our goal is by the time we launch, we want to have multiple B2B use cases that are already immediately ready to.
Well, let's talk about that now with regard to MVPs, demos, evidence that you really are moving forward. From what I can tell, you are certainly trying to expedite the entire process in arguably a faster way than most that I do talk with. And that is exciting to hear. You have the team to do it, no doubt. But where's the empirical evidence with regard to demos and I guess, code to show what you can do?
Right. So what we've been doing in the last 3 months, from perspective of the development, is we built a prototype. So we built most of the components of the blockchain, but we built them in Python, which allows you to iterate significantly faster, right? Where we can show that, yes, we can shard, yes, we can linearly scale, yes, we can run on low-end devices, right? So the goal was there primarily to invalidate incorrect assumptions. So we had to redesign quite a few of the ideas that we had initially. And that's something that I actually think every protocol needs to do. They need to build a prototype first to make sure that their ideas make sense. Writing white papers, with the theoretical stuff is one thing. Actually building and seeing how it works in practice is another. And now and so effectively that is something we can show to people, right? If someone comes to us and says, well, how do I know your protocol will scale? We can say, well, we can show you that it actually does, right? And so now we're building the production ready network, which we're going to have it out by the end of the year. That will be it will be in some state, so it's hard to predict how close it will be to the final binary, which will be the main net. But most of the things people will be able to see, and most of the development will be open source. We plan to open the GitHub repo within a couple of weeks from now.
Right.
And so also one thing, so our plan from perspective of how people will observe what's happening is that we're going to open source the testnet development way before it is ready. So people will see the progress, and the testnet hopefully will be out by the end of the year. And then people can deploy it on Kubernetes on the AWS or Azure cluster and see exactly how it operates, what sort of numbers it can provide, and do security analysis.
Right. So it sounds like you're in absolute top gear and you're going to be in that space for, that mindset for a while. What about your go-to-market strategy, the coupling of markets and marketing? Obviously, it's a very anomalous system we see in blockchain right now because there's a reliance on certain media entities, whether that be mainstream, whether it be crypto-based. What are you doing to ensure that people are, A, aware of you, and B, really foster the growth? Because developers alone and great tech alone will not, ensure the viability and success of any team or any startup right now.
Right. So that is a very hard question, right? Marketing is always hard. So our high-level ideas is we invest heavily into building credibility, because I think this is the primary thing which is missing today for many protocols. So Ethereum is not the only smart contracts protocol today, right? There are other protocols which are launched, and many of them have very low adoption, right? So that should be very concerning for any blockchain protocol which is being developed today. Right? There are more scalable protocols existing today which do not have Ethereum's adoption, right? There's got to be a reason for that, and I think the primary reason is lack of credibility, right? I, as a developer, if I actually want a decentralized application, Ethereum has built a ridiculous credibility, right? Ethereum is known to be decentralized, secure, and so from this perspective, people will choose Ethereum. Some other networks, or I would say in general, blockchain as the industry has practically zero credibility, right?
Especially if you subscribe to Nouriel Roubini's arguments of late. He's arguing the entire ecosystem of blockchain is complete rubbish. Obviously, he has his own economist position. He's experienced in the mainstream field of money, but this is a different argument entirely. But I did want to ask you with regard to the quadrangle that you put in your recent publication with regard to Perlin. And the reason why is because you've mentioned Zilliqa already. It's the only other one that's in the section of scalability, of significant scalability, with you as another. So in that context, do you feel like you're well situated for the future?
Against Perlin?
Yes.
I think actually we and Perlin are in completely different, we're not competing at all to each other. So Perlin would be more like a decentralized marketplace competing with decentralized compute marketplace, competing with AWS, meaning that instead of Amazon providing you the compute power, it will be people in the network providing you with the compute power, which is very different from running applications on chain, primarily because there is no security guarantees that the computation was performed properly, right? So someone is providing you compute, you're providing them an application, they execute it. It's very hard to prove that the application was executed properly or was executed at all, right? So to an extent, they will need to have some sort of arbitrage or some other way to deal with the fact that there are going to be people who will try to scam the system, right? But that is more of a marketplace. It's a very different approach. But if you compare, let's say, with Zilliqa and us, we're in the same market, right? So we're direct competitors to each other. The competitors to each other, we're trying to build sharded application platforms that execute every contract on chain.
Right.
And in general, that triangle of the trilemma it is a very interesting topic because that is something you cannot escape from. And so some protocols claim to trying to escape. So like we just had San Francisco Blockchain Week where multiple people were presenting, and there were multiple claims that they have all decentralization, scalability, and security. Right. So that is, I don't think there's a proof for that trilemma. That trilemma is just a hypothesis. That's a statement. But I personally believe in that trilemma, and so I do not take seriously any person that says that their protocol solves all of them. And so our approach, because we do want to be scalable, and we definitely want to be decentralized, right? So that would indicate we would have to sacrifice security, which is also unacceptable. So to an extent, the way we build it is we say decentralization is fixed. Decentralization, we do not compromise. However, between security and scalability, every person who deploys a smart contract, they can choose where they want to be. And I also believe that this is what Zilliqa is doing. Zilliqa has a similar, at least they have similar concept in the white paper.
Yes, they allow for that customizable, that choice, as you mentioned, between the different aspects of the tripartite offering. And I like that because with regard to enterprise as well, it allows them also which part they want to focus on.
Right. And so at the end of the day, if you do want to have security and scalability and you're willing to sacrifice decentralization, that is where you would go to layer 2, right? So in layer 2, effectively, if you run on Plasma, it is super scalable, it is super secure because you can move assets securely in and out, but it is not decentralized in the sense that you are trusting a single entity to run that, to operate the network, and that entity is providing the scalability and security.
Right. Well, let's now talk about money. Now, I want to talk in detail about your fundraising strategy. How much money have you currently raised? What's planned for the future with regard to future raises? Let's talk about lockups. Let's talk about team access. I want to know all of that stuff so it's really transparent for the listeners. Right.
So we just raised $3 million. The investors include Metastable, Electric, Accomplice, and Baidu Ventures.
All right.
And we could have, so effectively when we started fundraising, we were still researching the space and exactly what is happening in the blockchain investments. And so the biggest problem that every single protocol will face when there is money is that investors will have a major stake in their company, and investors are working for returns ultimately, right? So investors have their LPs who put certain expectations.
Like any fund, they want money. Right. Yes. They want returns.
Exactly. And many investors today in the blockchain space, they organize as hedge funds, right? So at the end of the day, they're trading whichever assets they have that are liquid. Right. And that is a huge problem for every blockchain protocol because a single investor can completely destroy their token by just selling the entirety of their stake. And
I'm glad you mentioned that. So what you're talking about there in translation is dumping. There's a propensity for certain VCs, particularly in the crypto space. We've seen it time and time again. A lot is happening in China in this respect, where they're not really disclosing their intention to buy you as an investment to dump you upon release in exchange.
Yes, exactly. And so the biggest challenge we were facing is we needed to make sure that every single investor whom we have in this round, because this round was at the lower valuation. All we had was, a team and let's say white paper and half-written prototype.
So
that is very little to show.
Highest risk for those who want to invest. We call that, the cornerstone round. Is that right? Or the seed round?
Yeah, we were calling it a seed round, yes. So we needed to find the most aligned investors in whom we would have absolute confidence that they will not ultimately dump us, right? So I personally have huge faith in Metastable and all other investors we have who invested in us.
So I wanted to ask you, though, in that respect, how do you actually do that DD and how do you really know? How do you ensure it? Is it because of the lockup design that you have put forth? The reason I ask is because in traditional markets, often there's an expectation of at least a year or 2 years lockup for investment. How do you know that Metastable, for example, because of its brand, will do it and will stay for the long haul?
Right. So obviously there's no way to predict, right? So you cannot really tell. So here partially
everything's transparent.
Right. So yes. So we did put a pretty long lockup. It is a multi-year lockup, which is quite unusual for many other raises. But in general, our research showed that interestingly, blockchain investments are very different from traditional venture fund investments, right? So this entire structure of hard caps, bonuses, etc. If you think about it, in many senses, in many ways, it does not make as much sense. Like, for example, hard cap effectively says we're going to limit how much money we can raise,
right?
Which is in nobody's interest. It's definitely not in our interest, because the more money we can raise, the better for us. And it is not in investors' interest, because if we can raise more money, we can deliver more, they can get more, right? So the hard cap is designed, and that's my understanding, right? That's again,
sure.
My understanding.
I mean, there's always an issue, though, with regard to valuations when they're very high, when we're talking about ensuring there's degrees of scarcity, because often there's a finite aspect to the tokenomics as well. So, you know, I guess there's economic reasons for this, and from an investor's perspective, and that is how majority of these people look at it when they inject their cash or their capital into it. They want to see a return at some point. So even Metastable wants to see growth in your company, short-term or long-term. I'd argue that, as you've mentioned, they tend to be long-term focused. But let's talk about the money side a bit more, though. You said 3 million in your seed round. Why so low? That's not a lot of money.
Right. So one reason is that huge consideration when you raise on tokens is that tokens do not dilute. So if you raise in equity, you can always print more shares in the future. And that's exactly what companies do. So you raise as much as you want. Ultimately, you can always print more shares. With tokens, at least the way we structure our token sale, tokens do not dilute, right? So if investors buy some percentage of tokens today, they maintain that percentage until the mainnet launch, right? So from this perspective, there's a certain valuation at which we can raise money reasonably today, and that's what we were doing. If we raise too much at that valuation, we give away too many tokens. That significantly reduces our ability to raise money in the future, right? And
right. So
from this perspective,
you're selling off too much of your company.
Right. And so from this perspective, 3 million is way more than enough for us today. We can hire a pretty large team, way bigger than we need today for that money. We can participate in whatever events in the world. 3 million is a lot of money, as a matter of fact, right? So we used to hearing companies raising 30, 60, 100 million in the blockchain space, 4 billion in some obscure cases, right? But as a matter of fact, 3 million is quite a bit of money. And so it makes way more sense for us to wait until we actually have something to show and then raise a proper round at a proper valuation later.
Well, let's talk about that now. So you've done your first round. It's all signed and sealed and delivered to your door with regard to capital. What's next? When is this next round happening? How much are you planning? What can you tell us?
So that is still not quite decided. So most likely we're going to be, we're not going to raise until we actually have the testnet out, because that puts us in a significantly stronger position. We would also prefer to have some letters of interest signed from some companies that are using blockchain today and would want to move to a more scalable blockchain, because again, that puts us in a stronger position, right? So, so at this point, we are in a state where we can wait until we can raise at very favorable terms, and that's effectively the plan.
Right. And what about crowd sales? Often we're seeing now ICO is not a hot topic for many people, despite that it is just one mechanism for raising cash or raising capital. What about in allowing people in the lay space to be involved? Is that a plan for Near Protocol?
Right. So ICO for a proof of stake system is actually a super convenient way of raising money, because this way you both distribute it among a wide set of people, which you really want to happen in a proof of stake system. You want the set of token holders to be as diverse as possible, right? And at the same time, you raise money. Unfortunately, in the United States, doing an ICO today is a super challenging task. And so most likely we will not. So at this point, the probability of us doing ICO is practically zero. Most likely there's never going to be a public sale.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm glad, and thank you for your transparency there. What about exchanges? Obviously, you're well and truly, busy doing the first iteration of programming since you've raised this capital. But when do you want to release on exchanges? What's the roadmap there?
So I think that we will not raise. So what many protocols do today, Zilliqa is actually a good example, is they list on exchanges way before they have anything out. And so what they do is they just create an ERC20 token, which is traded on the exchange. And then when they launch the mainnet, they just transfer the ownership. It is unclear why that would make sense, because it puts a lot of risk on your protocol. If the price of your token goes down significantly, there's no reason of launching anymore, right? So that's a huge risk, and it is unclear what you're gaining.
Right.
So you
and just using Zilliqa as an example, we have seen, that kind of evidence of a significant change in the value of that once it did go on to as an ERC20.
What was the example?
Of Zilliqa, because you're mentioning when you go on an ERC20, there's a risk inherent there because they're not using their own system, their own mainnet. That did happen with Zilliqa.
Right. Yeah. So at this point, I do not see much what we can gain from listing early. So the plan is effectively to list very close to the mainnet launch or effectively with the mainnet launch, right? So we are talking to the exchanges. We have proper contacts established.
And when you do you anticipate you'll have a lot of dApps lined up at that point?
Yeah. So the plan is to have, as I said, we plan to have multiple B2B use cases on the blockchain. However, that is more to show that it is actually something that people need. At the same time, we do plan to launch multiple apps as with the mainnet. So some of them we already. Most likely we will have some sort of a social network, just because it makes a lot of sense to have a decentralized social network for people who in this space. Besides that, we plan to have a couple other applications, and also we're going to have a series of hackathons similar to what EOS was doing before we launch. So hopefully from those we're also going to get few distributed applications. But ideally, yes, we want to have as many, maybe not as many as possible, but we want to have few applications already running as we launch.
Right. So around the globe, can we expect to see you more at conferences, or your team really trying to explain, educate about what the Near protocol is trying to do as you move forward? Or are you something that is going to be head down, bum up? You're going to be in the seats, in the lab, just focusing on building this out?
No, we are attending. So we were very involved at the San Francisco Blockchain Week. We were on multiple panels. We had a few presentations. We participated actively on the hackathon. On the hackathon, I was on the team with Vlad Zamfir from Ethereum Foundation. We built a sharding proof of concept. That was one of the 10 winners at the hackathon. So, and we are going to be at Web3 in Berlin. We're going to be in Prague at DEF CON. So we are actively touring. However, also it doesn't make much sense to show too much before you actually have something to show. So primarily we're talking today about technology, where we have a lot of expertise, right? So sharding is something where we have extensive expertise. We're talking a lot about that. We're not talking much about applications on our platform yet, because the platform isn't out. So there isn't much value for people in it yet, right? So by the time they can actually apply this skill, so today that skill is irrelevant. So closer to the launch, we will be more aggressive at touring again the world and talking more about how you would actually build for Near.
Absolutely. Well, Alexander Skidanov, it's been an honor really to speak with you today. And I sincerely mean that. You are someone who is the real deal when it comes to developing. You are an expert programmer. Your team is gold medal standard. It's been really interesting to learn more about the kind of understanding, the depths of sharding that you know. You want to move it into a very utilitarian focus, business focus, enterprise focus. I wish you all the very best. I'm excited to talk to you along your roadmap. Next year will be an interesting time for you. You all clearly want to move very fast, but you also want to educate the audience about this, and particularly those developers out there who want to interact more in the ecosystem. You now know about Near protocol. It's exciting to see what you can do in the future. And thank you very much for your time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks a lot.
Anytime.